100 years ago, the American motorcycle landscape was nothing like it is today. Much of the innovation and advancements in motorcycle performance was coming from American companies, and perhaps no other company embodies the spirit of innovation and forward thinking like the Flying Merkel company. Like many good things in American motorcycle history, it all started in Michigan with a young, brilliant mind, that of Joseph Merkel. A bright, talented young mind capable of learning difficult skills at a very young age. By 15, Joseph was learning metalworking, and this interest brought him to what is now Michigan State University to study mechanical engineering. Now, Merkel had a rare combination of talent and brilliance combined with a hard work ethic learned from a really young age. At 24, he found himself in Milwaukee working as a draftsman for E.P. Alice Company, basically in steam engine development. But within a few years of working there, he decided that it was time for him to go off on his own and design his own products, in this case, namely bicycles. Now, this was right around the year 1900, so the transition from bicycles to then motorcycles was pretty much happening right at this time. So it wasn't long after going on to make his own bicycles that he was then making motorcycles. Merkel was, like so many others, taken in with this idea of strapping these new combustion engines to the frame of a bicycle and powering it that way. So in 1901, Merkel built his first motorcycle. But where most companies trying their hand at motor bicycles would soon fall into sort of the annals of history to be long forgotten, Merkel's company was different. During his first 10 years of building motorcycles, Joseph experimented quite a bit with different displacements and even built a few automobiles. It didn't take long for Merkel to begin focusing on performance and start catering his machines to the new racing culture in America. Now, he was rarely directly involved in racing himself, but his machines were just too tempting for young riders wanting to go fast for various reasons. At this stage in motorcycle history, more displacement and more cylinders was really the name of the game. They were trying to make their engines bigger and faster. And in 1910, at the very beginning of sort of the board track racing craze in America, Merkel offered its first two-cylinder motorcycle shortly after merging his company with Light Motor Company. And in this regard, Merkel actually beat Harley-Davidson to the punch when it comes to building a V-twin configuration. And from this point on, his machines would take the name Flying Merkel, and it really did fit. These motorcycles were some of the fastest, but mainly some of the most comfortable, usable motorcycles in the world. These were very expensive machines, but the benefits usually outweighed the cost for riders. Merkel used incredibly high-quality metals, otherwise unseen on American bikes from this time, along with using German ball bearings instead of the more common bronze or Babbitt fittings. Plus, he was pioneering new, better ways to make the ride better and faster. Now, if there's any single aspect of motorcycles from this time that you as a rider would feel was very noticeably worse compared to today's bikes, if you were to go ride, let's say like a 1907 or 1915 motorcycle, it would be the suspension. But that wasn't the case with Merkel bikes starting as early as that 1910 V-twin. So in terms of suspension, Merkel was far and away decades ahead of the competition. Most motorcycles from this time had a rigid rear with girder-style forks in the front, but Merkel actually began implementing his own design for monoshock rear suspension, similar to that of, say, Yamaha's racing bikes of the 1970s, except in this case, it was 60 years before then, and, obviously similar to what current sport bikes use. Now, this suspension setup not only made for a better ride, but also saved weight and really eliminated much of the complexity for the rear suspension, but even more impressive was the Flying Merkel's front suspension. It was essentially a telescopic setup using dual springs. This design was so good and so far ahead that even after Merkel's company had ceased production, factory race machines from other companies would scrounge to get their hands on a Merkel front-end setup for their race bike because it was just so good. This made Merkel's motorcycles feel like machines from the future. Not only were they fast, but they were also very comfortable and usable and reliable. And this led to Merkel's advertising campaign, "All roads are smooth to the Flying Merkel," which very few companies at this time, especially when you think about what the roads were like, not many people could say this. If you wanted a bike that could go long distance without breaking down and without, you breaking down physically, a Merkel was the best option. These were some of the first sort of grand touring machines available, and they were fast. Now, speaking of speed and power, you can't talk about Merkel motorcycles without looking at the power plant behind some of these, which were some of the fastest motorbikes at this time. Besides the ball bearings mentioned already, Flying Merkels also utilized cam-operated inlet valves, while the rest of the competition were using the common atmospheric valve design. Basically, this means that instead of the valves opening and closing based on the difference between, the pressure in the cylinder and the pressure outside of the cylinder, that's how atmospheric operated inlet valves worked. His valves were mechanically operated, which better fitted the increase in revs and power from these bigger engines, and this made them also perfect for racing, and many, board track racers came out of the Merkel factory, branded in that iconic bright orange, well before KTM thought of making their bikes very orange. By 1911, the big twin from Merkel grew to 61 cubic inches and was producing about 9 horsepower. And that may not sound like much. A Honda Grom produces about 9 horsepower, but by comparison, Harley's 1911 early twin was about half the size and also about half the power to the Merkel. So this was a big, fast, powerful motorcycle for its time. But the biggest innovation, mechanically speaking, was Merkel's use of a self-lubricating system, again, decades ahead of his time in this regard. Now, at this time, riders who wanted to ride a motorcycle for long distance, they were in control of the oil, essentially, and they had to keep things lubricated, so the rider would have to periodically push a button to essentially squeeze more oil into the engine, and then the oil would just kind of drip out the bottom. It wasn't a great system, but this is how it worked. But Merkel did not like this system, so he created what was essentially, an automatic self-lubricating mechanism. So the concept itself was ahead of time, not actually the mechanism itself, but essentially the oil was pumped into the engine based on the throttle position. So as you upped your revs slightly, then slightly more oil would go into the system and vice versa. So obviously, self-lubricating systems and oil pumps and things like that would come along later down the road and would be far more advanced. But for this time, nobody else was doing this, and it really was a good system. It made it so the rider didn't have to constantly be pumping oil into the engine to keep it from, blowing up. Now, in the early 1900s, racing was not as organized as it is today. It's not like there was, one big specific organization like MotoGP or World Superbike, and we could just, type in a year and see who won the main championship in, say, 1913. Racing at this time was new, it was diverse, and it was spread out and often very local, from, endurance races for cars and motorcycles across countries and over various terrains to, local dirt races. But early on, word of Merkel's creations were spreading, and a young talent named Maldwin Jones got his chance to ride one, and he was amazed at the machine, and he decided to build his own Merkel up from a factory machine for his own use. And Maldwin would go on to race the famous Irwin G. Baker in a 10-mile race and actually defeat him. Now, the following year, Jones would officially turn pro and win 3 out of the 4 races on a Flying Merkel motorcycle. And over the next 20 years or so, Merkels would have success all over the world in racing for various riders and in various forms. By 1911, Merkel's factory team was expanding and would go on to win the famous national endurance run from Chicago to St. Louis. But like virtually every American manufacturer at this time, World War I struck, and these sort of boutique, high-end, but low-quantity manufacturers just wouldn't survive. It's not like Merkel was going to get a contract with the government to build motorcycles, because that's just not something they could have ever done, and this is why the only companies really that survived were pretty much Harley and Indian. Now, little is known of Joseph Merkel's life and career beyond about the 1920s, and despite their rarity today, his motorcycles would live on as some of the greatest bikes of these early years. Indian and Harley were no doubt influenced by Merkel, as well as some other brands that were lost to the war. Today, there are very few Flying Merkels available, as there weren't many to begin with, and many were parted out for racing purposes. One interesting example featured in Hemmings has a really cool backstory that really does show how committed Merkel was to making unique machines. This bike is currently fitted to be a board track racer, but it's really a pieced together machine. The engine engine was originally discovered in a small shop all the way over in Uruguay, and that engine was used for endurance racing in Argentina. And when the current owner stripped the engine down, he found that the cylinder walls were slightly thicker than the standard Merkels from this time, giving the machine less capacity and slightly less power for the sake of reliability for long hours of riding. This was a bike that essentially came out of the factory from Merkel, specially made for this purpose of endurance racing so that the reliability would be better. And I think this is a testimony to the spirit of manufacturers in these early days that is essentially all but gone in today's corporate world. You can't make it as a motorcycle manufacturer today, making motorcycles like this, the way that Merkel did. Listen to this showroom brochure from Merkel. In presenting the Flying Merkel, we believe we are offering you the world's finest motorcycle. No effort or expense has been spared to place the Flying Merkel on the top rung of mechanical achievement, and it is today, without a doubt, America's premier machine for comfort, speed, and reliability. It is a machine to depend on, a machine whose reliability is 1,000 times a proven fact. I wonder how many manufacturers today could honestly throw their name or any of their models in that paragraph. You know, in presenting the Suzuki V-Strom, we believe we are offering you the world's finest motorcycle. No effort or expense has been spared to place the Suzuki V-Strom on the top rung of mechanical achievement, and it is today, without a doubt, America's premier machine for comfort, speed, and reliability. I'm pretty sure we would all just laugh at most motorcycles being thrown into such an advertisement, except for, a few. Obviously, the world has changed and motorcycles aren't and really can't be developed like they were in these early formative years. But for me, the spirit is what's pretty much all but gone for most manufacturers. Now, I've already made this point multiple times in my videos, and all I'll say is that when manufacturers stop bean counting and really do focus primarily on making special motorcycles or motorcycles that really do what riders want them to do, the way that Joseph Merkel did, these are the motorcycles that, even though they may not make as much sense, these are the ones that end up making a lot of money for companies and for a very long time. Now, if you guys want to support the Merkel company and family today, check out the link below and either go buy some merch or, you can buy a Harley retrofitted to look like a Merkel, which is pretty cool. The Merkel family has fought hard to keep this brand in their family and to keep the company rights, so this really is a cool thing to support. Ultimately, the Merkel brand today hopes to build motorcycles in the future, so at the very least, just check out their site below and maybe go buy something. Alright guys, that's all I've got for this one. Hopefully you guys enjoyed learning a bit more about this piece of American motorcycle history, and until the next one, ride safe.